Lieutenant James Chen pressed his face against the cold plexiglass of the B-24 Liberator's nose section, watching another salvo of bombs fall uselessly into the Pacific. This was the 7th mission in 2 weeks where the Norden Bombsight, America's most guarded secret, that $1 billion miracle that was supposed to win the war, had failed to hit a stationary Japanese supply depot. The problem wasn't the bombardiers. It wasn't courage. It was mathematics. The Norden bombsight was engineered for the clear skies and moderate temperatures of European theater testing grounds. But here, 8,000 miles west in the humid, storm-racked Pacific, the device's calibrations were catastrophically wrong. Heat expansion altered the mechanical computers. Tropical air density threw off the trajectory calculations. The result? A bombing accuracy rate that had plummeted from 23% in training to barely 6% in combat. Chen wasn't a bombardier. He was a navigator, a 24-year-old former engineering student from Sacramento who'd been mapping routes across the Pacific for 11 months. But he'd spent enough missions watching bombs miss their targets to understand something the Army Air Force's brass refused to acknowledge: the Norden bombsight couldn't adapt to Pacific conditions. And if it couldn't adapt, thousands of airmen would keep flying into anti-aircraft fire, burning fuel, and dying for nothing. So he decided to fix it. The Norden bombsight was supposed to be untouchable. Literally. Armed guards watched over the devices. Bombardiers swore blood oaths never to let them fall into enemy hands. Destroying the site was prioritized over survival if a plane went down. The mechanisms were so secret that even the men who used them daily weren't allowed to understand how they worked. But Chen had an advantage: he wasn't supposed to care about the bombsight. He was the navigator. His job was charts and headings, not ordnance delivery. This gave him the freedom to observe without scrutiny. What he noticed was this: the Norden's analog computer calculated bomb trajectory using fixed atmospheric assumptions. Temperature, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Air pressure, standard sea level. Humidity, moderate. These numbers were hardwired into the mechanical gearing ratios and cam profiles inside the device. But over the Pacific? Temperature at altitude could swing 40 degrees. Humidity doubled the air density. Tropical thermals created updrafts that rendered the calculations meaningless. The Norden was still using European math in a Pacific war. Chen started carrying a notebook. After every mission, he recorded actual temperature, humidity, altitude, and where the bombs landed versus where they were aimed. Within 6 weeks, he had data from 42 bombing runs. The pattern was undeniable: there was a consistent mathematical offset that varied with atmospheric conditions. He could predict the error, which meant, theoretically, he could correct it. The workshop on Guadalcanal wasn't much: a cleared patch of jungle with a corrugated metal roof and workbenches made from salvaged airplane wing sections. Chen started spending his off hours there, officially to repair navigation instruments. What he was actually doing was far more dangerous. He'd managed to borrow a damaged Norden site that had been marked for return to the States. Using machinist tools and a technical manual he wasn't authorized to possess, Chen carefully disassembled the device. What he found inside was beautiful and infuriating: hundreds of precision gears, gyroscopes, and calculating mechanisms, all optimized for conditions that didn't exist in his war. He needed to add a correction factor, something that could adjust the bombsight's calculations in real time based on actual atmospheric conditions. But the Norden was already maximally complex. There was no room for additional mechanisms. unless he rebuilt the altitude correction assembly. Working by flashlight and using tools designed for airframe repair, Chen spent 3 months fabricating custom cam profiles. He salvaged differential gears from a wrecked B-25. He hand-filed correction plates from aluminum sheet metal. He created a simple slide rule interface that would let a bombardier input current, temperature, and humidity, which would then mechanically adjust the site's internal calculations. It was elegant. It was functional. And it was completely unauthorized. Chen's moment came on March 15, 1944. His crew was assigned to hit a Japanese fuel depot on Bougainville, a high-priority target that had survived 8 previous bombing attempts. Captain William Torres, their bombardier, was frustrated to the point of despair. "Another milk run to nowhere," Torres muttered during the pre-flight briefing. "We'll miss by half a mile like always." Chen waited until they were alone on the hardstand, then pulled Torres aside. "What if I told you I could double your accuracy?" Torres stared at him. "I'd say you've been in the sun too long, Navigator." Chen showed him the modified Norden sight. What followed was the most dangerous conversation of Chen's military career. What he was proposing wasn't just against regulations, it was potentially treasonous. Unauthorized modification of classified equipment. Possession of restricted technical manuals. If Torres reported him, Chen would face court-martial. But Torres had watched too many bombs fall into empty ocean. He'd lost friends on missions that accomplished nothing. And he could see that Chen's mathematics were sound. "If this works," Torres said quietly, "we'll both be heroes. If it fails, we'll both be in Leavenworth. Let's do it." They installed Chen's modified sight in the nose of their B-24 40 minutes before takeoff. The approach was textbook. Clear skies, minimal flak, no fighter opposition. The Japanese fuel depot sat exposed on the coastline, except it had been exposed for 8 previous bombing runs without taking a single hit. Torres activated the modified Norden sight, inputting the temperature and humidity readings Chen had gathered. The device hummed differently now. Chen's additional gearing created a subtle whine that wasn't part of the original design. "Bombsight connected," Torres reported. "Beginning run." Chen watched from the navigator's station, his throat tight. If this failed, he destroyed his career for nothing. If it worked, bombs away. The B-24 lifted as 6 500-pound bombs dropped free. Torres, Chen, and the rest of the crew counted silently. At this altitude, it would take 17 seconds for the fuel depot erupted. Not near it. Not around it. Direct hit. A massive fireball rolled upward as secondary explosions tore through the facility. The radio operator started shouting. The waist gunners were cheering. Torres just stared down at the destruction, then slowly turned to look back at Chen through the connecting passageway. Chen couldn't see his expression through the bombardier's goggles, but Torres raised one thumb slowly. One mission proved nothing. But it was a start. The problem with success in the military is that it demands explanation. When Chen's crew started hitting targets with unprecedented accuracy, 82% on their next 4 missions, people noticed. At first, it was just their squadron commander, Major Robert Hastings, who pulled Torres aside after their 3rd consecutive direct hit. "What's different, Captain?" "Your accuracy numbers just jumped 40 points in 2 weeks." Torres hesitated. He'd given Chen his word. But the results were too significant to hide. "Sir, I think you need to talk to Lieutenant Chen." The meeting in Hastings' tent was tense. Chen brought his notebook, his calculations, and a schematic drawing of his modifications. He expected arrest. What he got instead was silence as Hastings studied the materials for 20 minutes. Finally, the major looked up. "Lieutenant, do you understand that what you've done is modify classified equipment without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that possession of those technical manuals could get you 5 years in a military prison?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that if your modifications had caused a bombsight failure over enemy territory, you'd be responsible for the loss of an aircraft and crew?" "Yes, sir." "But the bombsights were already failing, sir." "Just slowly." "My way, at least we had a chance." Hastings leaned back in his chair. "Son, I should have you in the stockade right now. But I've got 16 crews in this squadron who can't hit their targets. We're losing bombers, losing men, and losing this campaign because our equipment doesn't work in this theater. If what you've done can fix that." He paused. "I need to see this work on another crew. Not yours, they might just be lucky. We install your modification on Lieutenant Morrison's plane. They hit their target, we talk to Group Command. They miss, we discuss your future at Leavenworth. Clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Lieutenant Frank Morrison was a by-the-book bombardier who'd flown 23 missions with a 9% accuracy rate. He was skeptical, methodical, and brutally honest about his failures, which made him the perfect test case. Chen spent 6 hours training Morrison on the modified site, how to input atmospheric readings, how the correction system worked, how to trust calculations that contradicted his instincts. Morrison asked technical questions that Chen barely knew how to answer. But the mathematics were sound, and Morrison was smart enough to recognize valid engineering when he saw it. The target was a Japanese radar installation on New Georgia Island, small, hardened, and critical. It had survived for previous bombing attempts. Morrison's crew took off at 0600 hours with half the squadron command watching from the operations tent. Chen wasn't allowed to fly the mission. Instead, he stood on the runway, watching Morrison's B-24 disappear into the morning haze, knowing his entire future hung on what happened in the next 2 hours. The radio crackled at 0847. "Dragon lead to base. Target destroyed. Direct hit. I repeat, direct hit. Request permission to speak with Lieutenant Chen upon return." Major Hastings looked at Chen. "Looks like you're not going to Leavenworth, son. You're going to Washington." What Chen didn't anticipate was how much the Army Air Forces hated being wrong. When his report reached Washington, it triggered panic at the highest levels. The Norden bombsight was the most expensive military project in American history. Billions had been spent. Reputations were built on its infallibility. Careers depended on it working exactly as designed. And now a 24-year-old navigator with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering was claiming it was fundamentally flawed for Pacific operations. The pushback was immediate and vicious. Engineers at the Norden Company insisted Chen's data was fabricated. Pentagon analysts argued that his sample size was too small. Senior officers suggested that what looked like a bombsight problem was actually just poorly trained bombardiers. They sent a team to Guadalcanal to disprove Chen's findings. The team spent 3 weeks testing, measuring, and analyzing. They flew missions with and without Chen's modifications. They interviewed bombardiers, reviewed gun camera footage, and studied Chen's mathematics. Their final report landed on the desk of General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, in July 1944. The conclusion was devastating to the establishment and vindicating to Chen. Lieutenant Chen's atmospheric correction system increases bombing accuracy in Pacific theater operations by 67% on average, with some crews showing improvement exceeding 80%. The modifications are mechanically sound, do not compromise bombsight security, and can be implemented across the fleet within 3 months. Recommend immediate authorization and production. By September 1944, Chen's Pacific Correction Assembly was being installed on every B-24 and B-29 operating in the Pacific Theater. The Norden Company, initially hostile, was now manufacturing the components under contract. Chen, promoted to captain, was touring bases from Australia to the Marianas, training bombardiers on the system. But the strangest part of the entire story was how the military handled the narrative. Officially, the modification didn't exist. There was no press release, no public acknowledgement, no mention in any official Army Air Forces publication. The Pentagon couldn't admit that their billion-dollar miracle weapon had needed fixing by a junior officer with salvaged parts. So Chen's name disappeared from the reports. The Norden Company took credit for the updated Pacific variant. The modification was implemented quietly, efficiently, and without any public recognition of where it came from. Chen didn't care about the credit. He cared that it worked. By the end of 1944, bombing accuracy in the Pacific had jumped from 6% to 41%. Fewer planes were needed per target. Fewer crews were lost. The strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to soften Japan for invasion became devastatingly effective. Some historians argue that Chen's modification shortened the Pacific War by months. Thousands of airmen came home who might not have otherwise. But you won't find his name in the history books. James Chen returned to Sacramento in November 1945 with a Distinguished Service Medal that cited technical contributions to aerial bombardment accuracy without specifying what those contributions were. He finished his engineering degree, worked for Boeing for 30 years, and never spoke publicly about the Norden bombsight modification. It remained classified until 1985. When researchers finally uncovered the story in declassified documents, they tracked Chen down for an interview. He was 67 years old, retired, and amused by the attention. "I didn't do anything special," he told them. "I just looked at a problem everyone said was unsolvable and refused to accept that answer." The real heroes were the bombardiers who trusted a navigator's crazy mathematics enough to bet their lives on it. Asked if he was bitter about the lack of recognition, Chen shook his head. "Recognition doesn't save lives. Working equipment saves lives. I got to see my modification on every bomber in the Pacific. That was enough." He died in 2003, largely unknown outside his family and a small circle of aviation historians. But his innovation is still taught at the Air Force Academy as a case study in field engineering and adaptive problem solving. The lesson isn't just about bombsights or World War II. It's about refusing to accept failure when lives are at stake. It's about trusting your mathematics even when everyone tells you you're wrong. And it's about the forgotten innovators who changed history without ever seeking credit for it. Lieutenant James Chen saw a problem that experts said was impossible to solve. He solved it anyway with salvaged parts, unauthorized manuals, and 3 months of midnight engineering. His modification tripled bombing accuracy and helped win a war. And for 40 years, almost nobody knew he existed. That's the real story of innovation under fire.